In this video, we're going to be talking about how to combine multiple exposures into one beautiful, seamless frame. If I had to give you just one technique that was going to help you with your architectural real estate photography, this would be it. Although the example I'll use in this video is from a commercial architectural photography shoot, this technique is applicable to all genres of architectural photography, whether it's real estate, residential, interior, exterior. It comes up all the time, and that's why I think this is so important for you guys to learn this. So very often when we're photographing buildings, one exposure on its own isn't going to capture the full dynamic range from those very brightest highlights right down to the very dark shadows. And this technique of exposure blending is a really great way around that. When you're on site, the simplest way for you to capture the raw photos that you need is to set your camera up in bracket mode, shoot one exposure, which is the base exposure, and that's what the camera meter thinks is probably the best exposure for the scene overall, and then shoot 2 stops under, 1 stop under, 1 stop over, and 2 stops over. Now admittedly, I normally only blend 3 exposures together. I have a base and the best shot for the highlights and the best shot for the shadows, and usually that's enough information to combine into that finished image. But I would certainly recommend cover your bases and shoot a bracketed set of at least 5. Sometimes I shoot 7 if the dynamic range, that difference between how dark to how bright it is extremely vast. Like if it's a really contrasty day, bright sun, you're shooting inside and you can still see the exterior, shoot more brackets in that example. But then using this technique, you'll still probably only end up using 3 of those exposures: your base image, your overexposed image, which is going to help you bring back the shadow detail, and then your underexposed image, which is going to help you bring back the detail in the highlights. Anyway, that's enough of an explanation about how it works. Let's look at how we do it. Okay, so in front of me we've got the raw photos that I'm going to be working on. This is the base exposure that the camera thought was correct when I took the image. This is 2 stops underexposed. This is 1 stop overexposed. That's according to the camera's meter. I actually quite like this exposure here, but it's certainly overexposed in the sky. So what I'm going to do is make sure auto sync is on so that all the changes I make to these photos are going to apply to all 3. And this is what we're shooting for here. This is a quick edit that I've already done in Photoshop using the technique that I'm going to be sharing with you. So how can we take this photo and turn it into this? That's what we're going to be looking at. So the first things first is normally my photos would be brought in using an architectural preset, and I've shared that information in my previous video and many others as well. So I won't go over it here, but basically we're dropping the highlights a little, boosting the shadows, and making sure that we have a good dynamic range by boosting the whites, dropping the blacks. A little bit of clarity, pop in a little bit of vibrance, a little bit of adjustment to the tone curve. Anyway, the key thing that we need to do, which isn't built into a preset, is actually define the verticals of the image. This is such an important step in any architectural or real estate photography. And so what we want to do is select the guided method, and we're going to draw one guide down a vertical on the left-hand side of the frame, and then choose another vertical on the right-hand side of the frame, basically as far right as we can go. And let go, and now we have a nice vertical image. And if we're not quite happy with the positioning of these lines, we can just come in and adjust them if need be. And the other thing we could change is the color balance of the image as well. I feel that it's quite cool, and we've got a nice sunset that was going on, so let's just see if we can enhance that slightly just by playing with the temperature. Okay, they're looking good as a set of images, but now I want to work on each one individually and make sure I'm optimizing my layers that I'm going to combine in Photoshop. And so as the base layer, I'm finding this is just a little bit underexposed, so I am going to boost this up probably about half a stop. And now I want to work on the other 2. So this is my underexposed image, and this is going to be responsible for bringing back all these details around the lights here, and also some of that rich color in the sunset as well. So my general approach for this is to get my highlights where I'm happy with them, where they look nice and rich, contain that luminosity detail and information that I want. And then the next step is to lift up the blacks and the shadows. I'm going to not worry too much about what they actually look like and the quality of those. Like if I hover over here, you can see that there's a whole lot of noise. Color noise and luminosity noise is pretty ugly, but I'm not worried about that because that is not going to be introduced into the final photo. The only thing that I'm concerned about is what's going on in these nice highlights over here. Now I'm just going to quickly press Shift F a couple of times just to give us a little bit more screen real estate. I'm going to close this down and press T to get rid of that toolbar section. Now if I hold shift and click this image here, we can see that the luminosity values of the shadows are pretty similar, and that's kind of what we want, but now we've got a lot more richness through in the highlights in this version that we've worked on, and that's what we're aiming for. So now the underexposed image is looking good for combining that with the original. Now let's work on this brighter image. Okay, this is the exposure we want to use for the shadow details. So in particular, all this wood up here, this looks great. This is a good exposure for the wood. But obviously we are completely blown out through the sky and all the interior of the property here as well. So all I really need to do for this one is just to make sure that the highlights aren't overexposed by too much. So I'm just going to bring the whites down and bring the highlights down, and this is not the information that I'm going to use for the final image, but it just helps with a much more seamless blend when you bring the three images together, when they actually appear in terms of their luminosity, their brightness, as a much closer set. So that's why we bring the whites and the highlights down on this brighter exposure, and why we bring the shadows and the blacks up on this darker exposure, just to get that overall brightness value closer to our original file here. And if I press N on the keyboard, we'll see all three, and their overall luminosity isn't too dissimilar. Now, one other thing that you can do is if you feel that things are just getting a little bit too flat, like in this one, things are just looking a little bit washed out, we can just grab that contrast slider and bump that up slightly, just so that we have more of a correct contrast balance in that as well. By the same token, if we feel that the dark one is too contrasty, we can take that contrast value in the opposite direction. And when we're happy with all three of our photographic elements that we're going to combine, we just select the three of them, we right click on one of the thumbnails, and we come up to edit in, and we want to open as layers in Photoshop. So I'm going to show you two ways that you can do this, guys. The first way is all through Photoshop. So if you own Photoshop, super easy, you can do it that way. It is a little bit more cumbersome and takes a little bit more technical know-how to get it just right. And then I'll show you a second way, which is my preferred method, using a plugin for Photoshop. So let's look at the first method, fully inside of Photoshop. So the first thing that I like to do is organize the layers into the appropriate order. So what I like to do is work with the base layer on the bottom, and we'll just call that base exposure. Then just out of personal preference, I like to bring in my highlights. So I put that next in the stack, and above that I add my shadows. So now my layers are in order, what I want to do is reveal the highlights, but only where I want them, and then the shadows only where I want them. So the way I need to do that is to create masks which are specific to the brightness values in the photo. And the way we can do that in Photoshop is pretty straightforward. All we need to do is reveal the layer by clicking the eye icon, add a mask to it, and currently as that is a white mask, we are revealing everything. If we were to fill it with black by pressing Ctrl Delete and filling it with the background color there, we could then paint in the highlights just where we want them. Obviously doing it with a brush, doing it manually, it's not very accurate, and it's also time consuming. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that, and I'll show you a much better way. I'll press Ctrl I, so we've inversed that mask and we're back to where we were. Now what we want to do is come up to Image, come down to Apply Image in the menu, and now with these default values that load into this Apply Image dialog box here, we've actually created, if you look at the mask here, a luminosity mask based on the brightness values of these pixels that has been applied to our mask. So if I click OK and then alt click on this mask, we can actually see what this mask is doing. And so basically we've got a grayscale version of the photo acting as our mask. And so if I hide that layer, you can see we're back to our original, and then I reveal it, and all of a sudden we're bringing this layer back in based on the luminosity of this mask, i.e. where this mask is white, we are revealing the pixels of this layer, and where it is black or close to it, we are hiding the pixels from that layer. And so that's a really great way just to introduce those highlights into this photo. And you could absolutely say I'm happy with that, but I like to refine this mask further and be more accurate with it. So with the mask selected, I come up to Image, Adjustments, and I'm just going to put a Curves Adjustments directly onto the mask itself. And what I want to do is make sure that my whites are pure white and my blacks are pure black. And we can even play with the actual contrast on this line as well, maybe push in an S curve. And now you can see in the mask we have a much more contrasty version of that mask, and that's going to push those highlights more specifically into those bright areas. So now if we look at our before and our after, before, after, and I flick between the two, you can see that we've introduced this lovely richness into the highlights here. And if you look on the interior of the property as well, we're just controlling those highlights as well. Now, one drawback of this method is that areas that are light but not pure highlights can sometimes get a little bit muddied. So for example, if we zoom in and we look at the aluminium framing here, if we look at our original and then I turn on our adjustment, you can see that things are just getting a little bit muddied, a little bit washed out in this area. And as I was explaining before, really the only area that we want this effect is in the highlights that are overexposed. And so the way to control that is to add one more mask on top of this to control this whole layer. And so the way I do that is by adding a new group, and that is then going to enable us to add one more mask to that group. And if I fill it with black, what I'm then able to do is much more loosely than before, come in and just paint this effect only where I want it. I can go to a 50% opacity and just paint that in through the sky there, just so we get a bit more of a gradient as that's introduced through the sky. And if I alt click on the mask, you can see what an absolute mess of a mask that is, but how quickly I was able to paint that in. And now we don't have that muddying effect going on through the midtones. We've utilized Photoshop's apply image technique to bring out a really precise luminosity mask, and then by adding it into a group, we've then been able to paint really precisely but very quickly where we want to introduce the highlights. And now we just want to follow the same process, but this time we're going to be bringing in the details in the shadows rather than the highlights. So I'm going to select the shadow layer, I'm going to apply a mask to that shadow layer, and now I'm going to come up to image, come down to apply image, and currently we have a very similar mask to what we had before, but this time by checking the invert tick box here, we are getting the opposite of what we had last time. So now the white areas in the mask are going to reveal this layer. Now, from understanding how masks work with white reveals, black conceals, you can see that we have a lot of mid-tone greys here, which means we're still going to be seeing some, so 50% grey would reveal 50% of this layer. We're still going to be seeing a lot of this layer, and that's not really what I want. We can see that we're certainly brightening up those shadows, but we're also brightening a lot of the mid-tones as well. Look at the blue in the sky at the top there. It's just getting a little bit too bright for my liking. I like that nice dark rich blue. So the way that we can control that through Photoshop, and I will show you a much better way to do it very shortly, but the way to do it through Photoshop is just to do that apply image one more time. So come up to image, apply image with the mask selected, not the layer. Make sure the mask is selected. We're using a blend mode of multiply, and so we're darkening everything down in that mask again. And if I click OK this time and alt click on the mask, you can see that we have much richer blacks through here. And just like last time, to control this even more precisely, I'm going to come up and I'm going to add a curves adjustment to this, and we can make sure that our whites are pure white, and so we can drop those mid-tones down, and the dark areas of the timber here where we've still got kind of mid-greys, we can actually grab that and brighten those up. So now anywhere that we've got white, we're going to be revealing all that lovely detail from the shadow layer, and anywhere where it's black, it's just going to conceal that, it's going to hide it, and we're going to see the original stuff from the layers that we have below it. So I'm going to click OK here, click back on the layer, and let's toggle this off and on. Off and on, and you can see that we're boosting up all of the shadows. But just like last time, I don't feel like I want that everywhere. Like if you look at the road here, the building had only just been finished. There's a lot of tire marks going up and down there. It hadn't been properly washed down. I don't want to bring attention to that. I prefer the original. So this is our before, this is our after. I like the original in terms of the foreground here, but in the detailed timber work up here, I certainly want to bring that information back in. And so we can use the same technique that we did before, which was creating a group, drag that layer into the group, and we're going to add a brand new mask. I held Alt while I clicked that, and that introduced a black mask, so we've hidden everything. And just like last time with default colors, so if I press D on my keyboard, I get white back. I can now come in and paint directly onto this mask. So I'm now revealing that precise mask that lives underneath this group only where I'm painting it, and I'm currently painting with 50% opacity, and so I can just sort of introduce this in layered swipes. And I just want to brighten up the pavement just outside the building as well. Just have a little scribble over the top there. Now let's see our before and our after, before and after. Now all of a sudden we've got all of that detail brought back into the wood. So to go from this original shot to what we've combined in Photoshop here, that's pretty much my starting point for all of my architectural and real estate work. So as you've just seen through Photoshop, it is perfectly possible to achieve this result of exposure blending in this method. However, I would strongly recommend, if this is something that you do on a regular basis like I do, you want to try and optimize the speed of this, get this as efficient as you possibly can. So now let me share with you the process that I actually use using this plugin. Now if you're interested in this, check out the link in the description below and I'll show you how we can get the result so much quicker. So this time we're going to use a tool called LUMENZIA, which is a plugin panel for Photoshop. It's a huge game changer and it's really inexpensive, and I've got a link to it in the description below, so it's well worth checking out. But let me show you what it does. Basically, we could select L here, which stands for lights. Now all of a sudden we have a luminosity mask over our image. If we want to refine it like we did in the process I showed you before and we think it's too broad, we can just press L2 here and things start getting more and more refined. If we want a little more precision, we have this slider at the side here, and so we might go in between L2 and L3 and say, okay, where we're seeing the white and the lighter pixels here, that is what I want to show from this highlights layer here. So by selecting that, all I need to do is click mask, make the layer visible, bada bing, bada bong, we've got our nice highlights brought in. So before, after. Nice. Let's do the same with the shadows. So we select shadows, and instead of going for the lights, now we want the darks. And if I press D here, we've got a very broad selection, and so again we're going to get these washed out pixels revealing what's going on in this shadow layer. We don't want that. We want things a bit more refined, so we might come down to D3, maybe even D4, I don't know, somewhere between the two of those. Hit mask, turn the eyeball on to reveal that layer. Here's our before, here's our after, and we can do exactly what we did last time if we want to just hide some of this. So we can make a group, mask that group, and with our brush tool set to black, we can just paint that away from areas we don't want to reveal that layer. Maybe a little bit up in the sky, so we're keeping that nice rich contrast. And just like that, we've got the same result as before. We've gone from this original image to this that brings back all the detail in the highlights and the shadows, and now gives us a perfect platform to go on and finesse our edit. And that's it. Exposure blending really is that simple, guys. We start with a base exposure, which is going to be our good solid foundation for the overall photo, and then we have a brighter exposure, which is going to handle the shadows and bring back some of those details for us, and then we're also going to have a darker exposed image, which is going to allow us to bring back detail into those highlight areas as well. In the name of giving you guys the complete picture on this process, I've just got to cover one more thing. One of the things you're going to find is that your image may start to look a little flat when you do this approach. I mean, which makes sense, right? If I hide these adjustments that we've made and we go back to our base exposure, you can see that we've got a lovely rich depth of contrast. However, we don't have those details in the shadow or the highlights. So as we bring those back, there's the highlights and there's the shadows. A byproduct of that is we lose contrast. So a quick way to fix that, and a tool that I really love to use, is Color Effects Pro. So I'm just going to make a stamped visible copy of this, and of course there's many different ways that we could approach the final edit on this, but I'll show you a really quick way. If we come up to Filter and I come down to the Nick Collection Color Effects Pro, and if you guys are interested in this, again I've got a link in the description below, and this filter is absolutely brilliant. If we look at our before here and I let go, here's our after. Look at all that rich detail that's introduced, and I've included 3 of my favorite effects here, which are the detail extractor and the pro contrast. Those are some real power changes. So if I turn these off and we go back to our original, we can see that first of all the detail extractor does exactly what it says on the tin. It introduces detail into your image, which is really great for architecture, but that's not really solving our contrast problem. And so I like to use the Pro Contrast tool, and as I turn that on, you can see the difference. Here's our original lacking that contrast, and as I turn that on, what a difference that makes. That is night and day. And we've got 2 sliders in there, the correct contrast slider and the dynamic contrast slider, and I normally apply that one just a little bit more heavily. And I really love these 2 tools, but they can start to make your image look a little graphic and crunchy. And so what I do to counteract that is I actually add a little bit of glamour glow. So let me turn that off and on. It's super subtle, but it just helps to soften the image back up. And then all I need to do is hit OK, and Nik Collection will run its calculations, and any second I'll have a nice contrasty version of that layer spat back out into Photoshop. And then if we mask that off, turn the mask black to hide everything, what we can do is just quickly use a paintbrush with 50%, let's say, and we can just start to paint that effect in just in the areas that we want to emphasize. So now by looking at the mask, we can see that we're going to maximize the emphasis over the building, a little bit through the sky with that grayscale there, and then nothing over that concrete, which was just getting a little bit out of hand. And doesn't that look so much better? If you think you'd benefit from using Nik Collection and you want to know more about it, how to use it, how I use it, just write Nik Collection in the comments below and I'll put a video together all about how I actually use that within my workflow. Here's my favourite bit of every video I do, guys. Here's our before and after. Let's look at the original that we exported from Lightroom, and then once we'd applied that exposure blending and Nik Collection, we came up with that. Isn't that so much better? From that to that, you've pretty much got a deliverable image there, guys, made up of just 2 steps: exposure blending, and then just adding a little bit of magic sauce with Color Effects Pro. If this is the first time you've come across exposure blending or luminosity masking, this may have just gone and you may need to watch this video again. Like I say, it's well worth learning this technique, but if it is a little bit too much for you, there's always the approach of using HDR software to combine these exposures, and the one I'd recommend is Aurora, because I've been using that for years with excellent results, and it saves you having to do all this. It does it automatically for you, but my preferred method is to use this panel inside of Photoshop. It gives you just that little bit more control so you can be more precise with your results and get the look you want back to your client. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have, and I'll see you in the next video, which may be popping up around my head right now. Hope you're enjoying the new channel. Let me know what you think. Cheers, guys. Catch you in the next one.